I was 28 when my husband and I bought a small farm in Appalachia, and this happened during our first winter there. We were still in that stage where every errand felt new because we were learning the town, learning where people went for feed and fencing and propane, and getting used to the fact that out there, everybody seemed to know everybody else. We were new, younger than most of the couples we saw around, and because we both look a little younger than we are, people tended to assume we were barely in our 20s. That day we'd driven into town to get a propane tank filled because the place still had some older heating stuff we were working around. It was one of those gray winter afternoons where the roads were damp but not icy, and the whole town felt half asleep. The Tractor Supply was busy enough to have a line, but not crowded. Just locals in work jackets, a couple older guys talking near the front, and one teenager at the register who looked like he'd probably rather be anywhere else. We had our tank with us and were standing in line when this man came in. I'd guess late 50s, maybe older. He didn't come in like someone who knew what he was there for. He walked in and just looked at us first. I remember that part clearly because it was odd enough to register right away. Then he grabbed some random women's shirt off a rack like he needed to justify being there. But he kept glancing back at us. He got in line behind us, close enough that I could actually feel him standing there. Not just normal small-town close, either. He was right there, like he didn't really understand personal space or didn't care. I figured at first maybe he was just one of those older local guys who talks too much and thinks everybody is his friend. So I turned a little, smiled, and said good morning. I honestly thought that would make him take a step back. It did the opposite. He started making small talk immediately. The weather, the line, how cold it had gotten. The usual nothing comments. Then it shifted fast into questions that felt too personal for a stranger. Where were we from? Had we just moved there? Where were we living now? How old were we? He asked it in this weirdly friendly tone, like he was trying to sound harmless while also gathering information. My husband gave him short answers, and I mostly stayed quiet. When we got up to the register, the kid working there started explaining the propane pricing. Before either of us said much, the man behind us got loud. Not loud enough to make a scene for the whole store, but loud enough to seize control of the interaction. He started cussing under his breath and acting offended on our behalf, saying things like they were charging too much and that they should cut us a break because we were a young married couple. The whole thing felt forced, like he'd decided to insert himself into our business so we'd feel like he was doing us a favor. Then he told us he had a 100-pound tank at his place he wasn't using, and we could just have it for free. My husband said thanks, but no. The man pushed it again. Said his place was only 20 minutes away, and he might even have 2 tanks. My husband said no again, a little firmer that time. The guy still kept going, and this was the part that stuck with me later. He said we'd need to do it right then because he had to leave for the airport in 2 hours to pick up his great aunt, and then head out of town. At the time, I didn't think much about that. It just sounded like one more detail in his rambling. It was only later, when we were back in the truck, that I realized how strange that was. Earlier in line, he'd already said he was picking somebody up from the airport in 2 hours. Then later he was somehow still free to wait around for us, drive us out to his place, and give us tanks. It wasn't a huge contradiction, but it was enough to make the whole act feel less natural. I told him no myself then, and I know my tone changed because I was getting irritated. He dropped the shirt he'd picked up, stormed out, and for a second I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. After we paid, we took the tank outside to the fill area. The lot was mostly empty. I remember hearing that metallic clanging sound from somewhere near the side of the building and smelling propane before I actually saw him again. He had pulled his truck around and parked next to the fill station like he'd been waiting for us. He got out and started right back in, same fake, helpful tone, telling us we should really think about getting a second tank because it would save us a trip. Then he changed it up and said maybe only one of us needed to come with him. The other one could follow later or meet him there. That was the moment it stopped feeling like a pushy local and started feeling actually wrong. My husband kept saying no. I told him we were fine. The man smiled at us in this thin way and said, "Come on, it's a small town, it's safe." I'd never heard a nice young couple. I didn't like that at all, because normal people don't say that. Normal people don't reassure strangers that they won't hurt them, especially not after trying that hard to get them into a truck. One of the outdoor employees came out then, either because he'd been watching or because he could tell something was off, and told the guy to leave us alone. Not politely either. He clearly knew he was out of line. The man stood there another second like he was deciding whether to keep pushing, then got back in his truck and drove off. What I noticed then, and what I'm glad I noticed, was that there was no plate on the truck. Not a bent one or a dirty one, just no license plate. We went home and spent most of the drive trying to act like it was just some odd encounter. Once we were back at the farm and the adrenaline wore off, it hit me harder. It was too many little things stacked together. The invasive questions, the fake outrage, the free propane, the rush, the attempt to split us up, the missing plate. A few weeks later, we were back there getting another tank filled, and the guy helping us outside asked, almost casually, if we'd ever seen that man again. We said no, and asked why. He told us the guy shows up in winter sometimes, mostly when it's quiet, and he only seems to take an interest in younger couples. That part bothered me more than the original encounter, not because it proved exactly what he wanted. It didn't. I still can't say for certain what that man planned to do, and I'm careful about making claims I can't prove. But the fact that he was known enough for an employee to remember him, and the fact that he had a pattern, made it feel like we'd brushed up against something that had probably scared other people too. We still live out there. I still love the area. Most people have been decent to us, but that was one of the first times I understood that in a small town, being told a place is safe can make you let your guard down too early. Sometimes the worst part isn't one obvious monster everybody knows to avoid. Sometimes it's the guy who's been around just long enough that people shrug and say he's weird, instead of asking why he keeps trying the same thing. I still think about that line sometimes. It's a small town. It's safe. That was the most unsettling part of the whole thing, because he knew exactly what kind of sentence should have worked on us. I was 22 when this happened, around 2010, and I was traveling for work with one of those church directory photography companies. The job itself was pretty simple. We'd rotate through small towns, stay in whatever hotel was nearby, set up at a church, photograph families all day, then do it again somewhere else a few days later. Everybody drove separately, so even though I knew the other photographers, we mostly had our own rooms and our own schedules. The town that week was Harlan, Iowa. I remember that because it was exactly the kind of place you pass through and assume nothing bad is going to happen there. Quiet roads, modest houses, people who nodded when they passed you. The hotel wasn't fancy, but it was clean enough. There were 4 of us there from our company, 2 guys, another woman, and me. We worked long hours, usually late into the evening depending on how many families were booked. So whenever I had downtime, I mostly just wanted to shower and sleep. One morning, I went down to the breakfast area before work. I hadn't slept well the night before, and I was half awake, just sitting there watching the TV mounted in the corner while I picked at hotel eggs. There was a man in the room, too. He looked like he was maybe with some road crew or construction group staying there. Work boots, regular clothes, nothing especially memorable at first. He looked over at me and I said good morning the same way I usually would to anybody. That turned into a short conversation, just polite, ordinary stuff. He said he was there with a crew working nearby. I said I was in town for photography work at a church. When I got up to leave, I said something offhand like, "See you later," the way people do when they don't mean anything by it. He answered in a tone that made it sound a little more literal than I intended, but I still brushed it off. Since I didn't have to be at the church until around 11, I went back up to my room and decided to lie down for a while. The room phone rang not long after I got settled. That was unusual enough that I picked it up, thinking maybe it was the front desk. I said hello and nobody answered. I waited a second, then hung up. A little later it rang again. Same thing. Then again. After a few rounds of that, I finally just took the receiver off the hook and set it beside the base so it would stop. I remember feeling annoyed more than scared at that point. Hotels are weird places. You assume there's some dumb explanation. When it was time to leave, I stepped into the hallway and saw the breakfast guy out there. That was my first little jolt. Not a big one, just enough to make me notice. He asked where I was headed, and I told him to work. One of the other photographers, the woman on our team, showed up, and I ended up riding with her to the church. On the way there, I mentioned the silent phone calls, and she told me she'd gotten strange calls too. That should have been the point where I recognized it for what it was. Instead, I still kept trying to make it ordinary. That night, there was a storm. Not just rain, but that dark, charged kind of storm the Midwest gets where everybody starts talking about tornadoes, even before anything touches down. A few of us stood in the lobby area for a while, watching the lightning through the front doors. I remember the parking lot lights reflecting off the wet pavement and the sky flashing white every few seconds. By the time I went back up to my room, I was exhausted. Not long after I got in, someone knocked. I almost ignored it, but I cracked the door to see who it was, and it was him. He was standing there like it was completely normal, smiling a little, saying I'd told him we could hang out sometime. I told him I'd been working all day and was tired and needed to sleep. Then I shut the door. That was the first moment I was actually uneasy. Still not in full panic, just that quiet instinct that starts telling you a normal person would have understood the situation differently. I locked the door, called my mom for no real reason other than I wanted another person on the line, and tried to talk like everything was fine. At some point while I was on the phone, I had the feeling he hadn't actually gone away. I don't know what caused it. It was just sudden. I whispered to my mom to hold on, crossed the room as quietly as I could, and looked through the peephole. He was still there. He wasn't knocking anymore. He was standing off to the side of my door, turned partly toward it, like he was listening. Then he moved behind the little section of wall where the hallway jogged in around the doors, and I realized he seemed to think that if he leaned back far enough, I wouldn't be able to see him. That scared me more than if he'd just kept pounding on the door. If somebody bangs on your door, at least you know where you stand. This felt patient. He was waiting to hear movement, waiting to see if I was really alone, waiting for me to open it again. I went to the far side of the room and started whispering to my mom because I didn't want him hearing my voice near the door. My heart was racing hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. My mom told me to call the front desk, so I did. I also got in touch with the other woman from our work group, and between the room calls and the door situation, the hotel finally took it seriously. They moved us to different rooms, and they contacted the man's crew supervisor or manager. I never got every detail of what was said, but I was told he'd been instructed to stay away from us. A few people from the church we were working with even offered to let us stay with them instead, which was kind. But by then I was too rattled to trust anybody I didn't already know. Nothing else happened after that. I didn't see him again. What stayed with me wasn't one dramatic moment. It was how easily something ordinary became access. A breakfast conversation. A casual see you later. A hotel room number that, in a small place, probably wasn't hard to get by watching or asking the wrong person. Then the phone calls. Then the hallway. Then the waiting outside the door. It also bothered me that the other photographer got calls too. That told me he wasn't fixated on me specifically from the start. He was testing doors, testing reactions, seeing what he could get away with. After that trip, I got a lot more careful about what I said to strangers when I was traveling for work. Not rude, just less open, less willing to fill silence because I felt awkward. You don't think small-town hotels can feel dangerous until you're alone in one, listening to somebody you barely know stand outside your door long after the conversation ended. I still remember the way he tried to hide from the peephole. That was the part that made me understand I hadn't been dealing with a misunderstanding. I'd been dealing with someone who had already decided he wasn't done with me. I'm 20 now, and the secret in this story didn't come out all at once. It came out in pieces over years, which honestly made it worse. If somebody had just told me the truth at the beginning, I would have known what I was dealing with. Instead, I spent most of my childhood treating one of the people around me like she was there to help me. I called her Auntie. That wasn't her actual name. It was just what I was told to call her when I was 7 and started seeing her once a month. My mother would take me to her house, not an office, just a regular house. And I'd sit in her living room while she typed on a laptop and asked me questions about my life. I was told she was a psychologist. At that age, you don't really know what that means, beyond the fact that adults speak to you in a softer voice and ask how you're feeling. So I trusted her. The setup felt normal to me because it had always been normal. We'd drive there. I'd sit in the same room. She'd ask about school, my home life, nightmares, things like that. And she'd type while I talked. My mother would wait elsewhere or come back later. It was all routine. And when you're a kid, routine gets mistaken for safety very easily. I had a bad childhood, and I'm not trying to be dramatic when I say that. A lot of my early years are either blank or foggy. I know pieces from police reports, things relatives have said, and a few sharp memories that never really went away. Because of that, I clung hard to adults who were presented to me as safe. Teachers, counselors, people like that. Auntie was one of them. The first cracks didn't show up until I was older, probably around 14. By then I was depressed in a way that wasn't vague anymore. I was asking direct questions. Why do I feel like this? Why am I like this? Why do I want to die sometimes? I told her things I had never told anybody else because I assumed that was the point. She'd listen, nod, type, and then somehow the conversations kept circling back to defending my mother. Not outright, not in a way I could easily point to then, but enough that I always left feeling like I'd explained something painful and somehow been turned into the problem. I kept excusing it because I didn't know better. I thought maybe therapy was just supposed to feel frustrating. Maybe she was pushing me. Maybe I was too young to understand what she was doing. That was one of the most damaging parts of it. I kept assuming there had to be a professional reason behind things that made me feel worse. As I got older, it got stranger. When I was around 16, I started going to parties sometimes, drinking, doing normal, stupid teenager things I didn't tell my mother about. Then Auntie started asking very specific questions about those exact things. Not general questions, specific ones. She would bring up people I'd been around or decisions I'd made in a way that made no sense, unless she was getting information from somewhere else. I remember sitting there thinking maybe she was just good at reading me. That was how hard I was still trying to preserve the idea of her. Then the sessions changed again. Toward the end of them, she started inviting my mother into the room and repeating things I'd said. Not summaries, not careful therapist language, just telling her, in front of me, things I'd said about being hurt, angry, isolated, or afraid. My mother would sit there hearing it all, and I'd feel this awful, trapped feeling because I still didn't have the language to say what was wrong with the setup itself. My grades dropped. My home life got worse. I got more isolated. I hit a point where I was seriously suicidal. And on my 17th birthday, I went into my mother's room looking for anything I could use to end things. That wasn't some dramatic plan. It was desperation. I was tearing through drawers and shelves and ended up in her closet. There was a suitcase tucked under some clothes, I opened it because I was in that frantic state where you stop thinking about what belongs to who. It was full of papers. That moment is still one of the clearest I have. I sat down on the closet floor and started reading, and what I was holding were transcripts. Printed transcripts of sessions between me and Auntie going back years. Not just recent ones, old ones. Things I'd said when I was little. Things I'd said when I was vulnerable. Things I had absolutely believed were confidential. My mother had them all. I can still remember the exact physical feeling of that. Not just shock. It was nausea. It felt like all the air had gone out of me at once. I took some of the papers, enough that it wouldn't be immediately obvious, and left the rest. That was the point where I stopped asking whether something was wrong and started asking what exactly the arrangement was. After that, I paid closer attention during every session. I looked around Auntie's house more. I asked my mother more direct questions. She kept repeating that Auntie was a psychologist, and I kept pretending I accepted that answer while trying to find some proof of it myself. Finally, I did something reckless and stole my mother's phone while she was in the shower. I ran out of the house with it and went through everything I could. Messages, call logs, social media, contacts. I found the number she used for appointments, but the texts themselves weren't enough to explain anything. The call logs showed they spoke constantly. That alone told me the relationship was far more personal than I'd been led to believe. The real answer came through social media. I found Auntie's account under a different name, and when I dug through it, I found photos of her with my mother and my mother's friends from years before I was even old enough to understand what was going on. She wasn't some outside professional. She was somebody my mother had known long before I was born. Later, I found out the worst part. She wasn't a psychologist at all. She was a chemistry teacher. That sounds almost absurd saying it that plainly, but that was the truth. I had spent years disclosing private things to one of my mother's friends in her living room while she typed them up and passed them along. All of that authority, all of that trust, all of those sessions, and none of it was what I had been told. After I went home that day, my mother beat me for taking the phone. I barely even registered the physical part of that because by then the bigger betrayal had already landed. I asked her who Auntie really was, and she still wouldn't answer properly. That's what stays with me most. Even after everything was exposed, she still acted like the lie itself wasn't the real problem. I moved out when I finally could, and I'm in university now. For a while, I thought the story more or less ended there, just with distance. Then when I was clearing old followers off my Instagram, I found an account that looked familiar. It was Auntie. She had been following me there too. That explained another piece of it. The oddly specific questions in the later years. The things she somehow knew. She hadn't just been hearing things from my mother. She had also been watching me directly. I cried that night harder than I had in a long time. Not because it was new information exactly, but because every time I uncovered one more part of it, I had to reprocess the whole thing again. Childhood, trust, privacy, therapy, family. None of those words meant what I thought they meant when I was younger. A couple days before I first posted about it, I had my first appointment with an actual licensed psychologist. I checked credentials myself. I checked where he worked. I checked everything. I felt embarrassed even explaining why that mattered so much, but he understood immediately. That appointment was the first time the idea of getting help didn't feel like a trap. What still bothers me most is how ordinary the lie looked from the outside. A mother taking her daughter to a trusted adult, a house in a familiar area, monthly visits, somebody typing notes. Nothing about it looked dramatic. It just looked respectable enough that nobody questioned it. That's what made it work for so long. The scariest secret I've ever lived with wasn't hidden in some abandoned place or buried by strangers. It was folded into routine, introduced as care, and protected by the fact that I was a kid and everybody around me expected me to accept what I was told. I don't call her auntie anymore. And I don't let anybody near my head just because an older adult says they're safe. If you like this content, like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.